Okay, we might get started, everyone. Hello and welcome. My name is Tess Hardy, for those of you who don't know me. I'm an Associate Professor at Melbourne Law School and I'm the Director of the Centre for Employment and Labour Relations Law. It's my great pleasure to chair tonight's panel, which is co-hosted with the Centre for Comparative Constitutional Studies. Before we formally commence, I would like to acknowledge that we're holding this event on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. And I would also like to acknowledge the importance of Indigenous knowledge in the Academy. As a community of researchers, teachers, professional staff and students, we are privileged to work and learn every day with Indigenous colleagues and partners. And I've actually been engaging in that learning myself this afternoon because Melbourne Uni launched their cultural education program, Gaguk, earlier this week, and I learnt some new things about the relationship between the university and the Indigenous peoples of Australia. So, we have a stellar panel lined up for you. Josh Bornstein from Maurice Blackburn will be providing a summary of his excellent book, Working for the Brand, How Corporations Are Destroying Free Speech. This will be followed by commentary from my Melbourne Law School colleagues, so Professor Joo-Cheong Tham and Professor Adrienne Stone. And we'll be wrapping up with some commentary from Misha, Ketchell, the editor of The Conversation. We'll come back to Josh for some reflective or concluding comments before we turn over to you for a short Q&A session. I would just like to thank the speakers for their time and to also acknowledge the assistance of Angela Henley-Boyes and the Law Research Support Team, as well as the colleagues, my colleagues at the Centre, Carolyn Kelly and Tom Havala, for their help this evening. So many thanks for your attendance, for coming in on such a wild and woolly evening. And over to you, Josh.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Melbourne University and Joo-Cheong and colleagues and Tess Hardy and colleagues for the opportunity. I wrote Working for the Brand because I have a condition. I suffer from an excess of passion, and sometimes in order to deal with that condition, I try and turn it into something constructive. And in a sense, it's my attempt to really understand my working life, but also understand events around me which are relevant to my working life. One of the key arguments in the book is that we're living through a second Gilded Age. I'm not the first person to have made that observation or argue that point, but I've witnessed the ascension of corporate power through my career, particularly as union density declined. And so the book is a critique of corporate power, but through a lens of free speech. It argues that as a result of 40 or 50 years of the neoliberal project, power has shifted away from consumers, workers and citizens and in the direction of corporations. And that's been a theme of my working life, despite my best efforts to stop it happening. We've failed. We've failed in big cases that I've been involved in to stop union busting. And as I've borne witness to probably the most dramatic collapse in union density in the OECD, I think except for Turkey, Australia has collapsed dramatically, quite savagely in terms of its union density. I think which is about 8 or 9% in the private sector. There are some states in America now that have stronger union density than our union density in Australia. So it's been a particularly dramatic thing for someone who's worked in the area that I've worked in to observe. And one of the other thing that's happened, not just in Australia, but across many OECD economies, is concentration of market power. Monopolies and oligopolies have grown, and their reach into multinational behemoths, if I can put it that way, has become more and more spectacular. As their power has grown, I think we've seen a range of different abuses, not just in the labour market, but towards consumers and others, multiply. So I focus really on one dimension of this story, but use it in some ways to then branch out into a broader critique. So I focus on what I regard as corporate censorship or corporate cancel culture, which has a particular rhythm these days in the online world, where someone says or does something that creates a reaction, creates anger, that often turns into an online mob calling for their punishment, that can be amplified by the Murdoch press, and it multiplies, and the corporation is then pressured to punish the employee by depriving the employee of income. And each time the corporation is in that position, it has a choice. It doesn't have to succumb to that pressure, but we see most of the time, if not all of the time, that's what tends to happen. And I describe in the book how that brutality can have very devastating consequences, particularly in a case that I highlight of a journalist called Scott McIntyre, who was sacked about his tweets about Anzac Day. As unions declined and the employment contract became more and more dominant in determining what happens at work, I began to see more and more onerous, repressive terms that appeared in employment contracts. And so employment contracts follow a fashion, a bit like human resources does, and so you often see similar terms in similar contracts, and the only real difference is trying to work out which font of which law firm was used, including from some of my colleagues here in the audience, to develop those contracts. Because at least in the good old days, you could tell a Clayton Utz from a Freehills, from a Arthur Allen's Rob contract. And I say in the book, in the 21st century, labour markets of diminished liberal democracies, including Australia, the UK and the US, the power imbalance between major corporations and their employees has become so repressive that each time an employee starts a new job, they not only sell their labour to the company, but they trade away critical parts of their citizenship. They are forced to promise in their life that they will not say or do anything to disturb the corporate brand, particularly on social media. They cannot be sure what that promise entails, and the corporation can't either. And so what I'm referring to there is the net. When you sign an employment contract, you sign up to a code of conduct and its policies. You often haven't read any of those things, and those documents can be unilaterally varied at any time by the employer. But if you discern what's in the fine print, the net effect is you've signed up to an obligation not to do or say anything that brings the organisation or the corporation into disrepute, or is harmful to its reputation, or is controversial. And you often sign up to corporate values, which I critique in the book, that are impeccable: respect, integrity, fairness, decency, and so on, love of mum and dad, etc. But if you analyse the standards and the values, they are incredibly vague, and no one can comply with them at all times, even though that's what the stipulation often says. They're stipulated to apply at all times, both at work and outside work. And no one can always be respectful, fair and decent at all times, at least in my humble estimation. So the combination of vagueness and a standard that no one can meet leaves open an enormous area for the employer great discretion to invoke those stipulations capriciously and arbitrarily and punitively. No one has any idea what's inside the rules, what's within the rules and what's outside the rules. This is not a power that it could ever be conceived of in a liberal democracy that government would wield, in my view. There would be protests in the streets and there would not be a liberal democracy that could exercise such a power. But in discussions about cancel culture and free speech, the power wielded over millions of people in the labour market by corporations is not discussed, and that was part of the inspiration for the book. To some extent, I don't dwell on this in the book, but to some extent we have laws that moderate that power, unfair dismissal laws, which I would argue are pretty hopeless. You will have seen the Antoinette Lattouf case, a very rare beast indeed, because it's very rare to get a case about political opinion and unlawful termination to trial, and I didn't think it would go to trial. And in fact, I think I wrote the book just after, or I had to meet deadline just after starting to act for Antoinette Lattouf, and I didn't expect the case to go to trial, but the ABC was pretty much insistent. And when I wrote this, I thought the case would settle. As I write, the legal dispute continues. Strangely, the ABC has emphatically denied that it succumbed to public pressure. That denial continues even after the ABC unsuccessfully argued that it did not sack Lattouf, but instead merely varied her duties to nil. At, quote unquote, that I should have put, at hearings before the Fair Work Commission, ABC management confirmed that Lattouf had not breached its social media policy and that a direction not to post controversial material had not in fact been given to her. Contrary to the denials, the ABC had applied brand management orthodoxy. It panicked and capitulated to a loud mob. It established a new invidious benchmark for panicked brand managers. Lattouf was sacked for posting a fact. So as I said, I didn't expect the case to go to trial, but the ABC, as I argue in the book, and I underestimated this, litigated that case like they were ExxonMobil or BHP or Telstra. Their behaviour throughout was super aggressive. We deliberately made an open offer just about the time I wrote that to settle for $85,000 and an apology and 5 shifts. And as we now know, they're going to spend over $2 million on the case. And once they got in the witness box, they were, to use a technical legal expression, chopped liver. So, and I've just had Antoinette Lattouf was sacked for posting a fact, which was she referred to a Human Rights Watch report. A bit of irony that the report was the first report to come out and say Israel was using starvation as a means of war in Gaza, and she posted, HRW has posted this report alleging this, and that was the ostensible reason that she was sacked. I just had coffee 2 hours ago with Kenneth Roth from the Human Rights, who was the head of Human Rights Watch at that time, and he just kept asking, why were the ABC so stupid? And I really don't know why they continued and continued and continued, but all I can say is they acted not so much like a public broadcaster, but very much like a corporation defending ruthlessly its position and pumping out misinformation to suggest things like we didn't buckle to external pressure, there was a direction given, there was a breach of this policy, and so on, in a way that was very, very disturbing and disappointing. How long have I got, by the way? I should just check. 5 minutes. 5 minutes? Okay. So there's a critique of the 21st century corporation in the book. I essentially, in summary, argue that corporations have, in the last 40 years, reduced employment of secure employees and outsourced or restructured to make labour cheaper and more precarious, busted unions, avoided and evaded company tax, sabotaged efforts to mitigate climate change, all the while promulgating immaculate company values and citing breaches of those values when employees say or do something controversial. There's an argument in the book that as their behaviour's deteriorated, they've invested much more heavily in ethical brands. And there's a study that I use or rely on and refer to in the book which suggests that corporations which have ethical brands and invest heavily can withstand scandals and survive them and in fact keep going with very little impact on them. So it's a very successful formula to maintain their dominant position, to continue to avoid proper regulation and taxation, and ultimately, in my view, become an anti-democratic force both inside the gate and more broadly outside in the political realm. And as I argue, corporatisation has infected other institutions like public broadcasters, but even universities. And so I'll briefly mention something about that now. And I note that last week the University of Sydney directed that an academic take down his Palestinian flag, and in doing so said, drew his attention to the flag policy at the University of Sydney, notes that flags must not be flown from university infrastructure without approval from the brand team. So I have a chapter about what happens when academic freedom crashes into the university brand. And we see the same sorts of things, university policies prohibiting conduct or speech that's damaging to reputation. Some have morals clauses still in employment contracts at more senior levels. But although it's a not very hopeful book, one source of hope in the book is that the enterprise agreements, the collective agreements in the NTU mean that the most successful resistance in the UK or the US or Australia to corporate brand management actually happens in Australian universities because of collective agreements which protect academic freedom. And that was spelt out very spectacularly in a case called Reed and James Cook University, where the High Court dealt with the clash between these policies and stipulations in the enterprise agreement and said intellectual freedom is not qualified by a requirement to afford respect and courtesy in the manner of its exercise. That same High Court ironically said in another case involving a unionist with a poster saying "Scabs, no principle, no guts," that he wasn't sacked because of his industrial activity. He was lawfully sacked because he breached the respect policy at work. So university academics who are protected by those sorts of enterprise agreements survive this cancel culture far better than anybody else. And in America, it's a bit of a bloodbath with academics even now, with the Gaza debate continuing. Ultimately, it's a book about democracy, and I'll just finish up by a quote towards the end of the book where I say, "The battle for democracy at work is intimately connected with the broader democratic struggle. Workers acting collectively are one of the most critical forces that moderate the immense power wielded by corporations. By operating as a check on unbridled managerial force, unions reduce the wealth and associated power of corporations and their owners. They also participate in the political process to mitigate corporate influence. Strong democracies depend on robust trade unions. Weak democracies invariably contain weak and diminished unions. I should add, strong democracies also need strong universities, strong public interest media and robust and agile government. I'll stop there and hand over to Joo-Cheong.
Thank you so much, Josh. There's much to say about this book. I think it's really rich with insights and really a reasoned argument. I wanted to focus on what I consider the 5 central insights in my mind. And the first insight is that corporate power at the workplace is typically wielded through contract. And I think there's a really important chapter in the book on chapter 2, Flexible Control, which really documents how control is intrinsic to the contract of employment. And I think this is a neglected truth because, the ideology of the contract conjures up images of freedom and consent and so on and so forth. And in fact, really invokes really the powerful words, the powerful statements were made by Justice Higgins more than a century ago. And Justice Higgins is, of course, one of the most influential industrial judges in the country, handed down the Harvester living wage judgment. And he said in the Federated Engine Drivers case, the power of the employer to withhold bread is a much more effective weapon than the power of the employee to refuse to labor. Freedom of contract under such circumstances is surely misnamed. It should rather be called despotism in contract. Insight number 2, and Josh has spoken about this. Corporate brand management is often founded upon moral rhetoric and doublespeak. So the book is basically threaded through examples of ethical brand washing, ESG, social justice campaigns of corporations. And the book really draws out how there are stark contradictions with, let's call it, the core business of corporations. I particularly like the section about Alan Joyce, Josh, that is the section entitled Alan Joyce, the Social Justice CEO. Also true, and I learned, even as a labor lawyer, I learned a fair bit in terms of the clauses that actually find themselves into contracts. And I really found the discussion about moral clauses really enlightening. And it got me to look up what is the University of Melbourne's, this is one of the policies called Appropriate Workplace Behaviour Policy. So the policy, in its words, says, it reinforces the obligations on individuals to act in good faith, with trust, ethically and with integrity in the best interest of the university. And as there are quite a few Melbourne University employees here, I hope that you're all abiding by these obligations at all times. 24/7. It's worth reflecting here in terms of the standards, this really rigorous standards imposed on employees and the wage theft that's occurred at university, with over 30,000 employees underpaid to the tune of 49 million. And to my knowledge, not a single senior manager that's been involved in this debacle has been dismissed or disciplined for what has actually occurred. Now, there's also the problem of vagueness that Josh has spoke to, and there's really, and pun intended, there's really a pungent sentence in the book that where Josh says inappropriate. It's not so much a weasel word as a skunk word. It pollutes more than it illuminates, deployed to mask an absence of meaning. The third insight I draw, and perhaps it's controversial, is the ambiguity of the equality and diversity agenda. And Josh's book here clearly recognizes the discrimination experienced by First Nations communities, women, LGBTI communities, and ethnic groups. And such discrimination is, of course, connected to the history of this country, colonization, and the White Australia policy. And as a migrant to this country, as someone who came to this country as an international student and someone who specialized in research on migrant workers, I can testify to that bracing truth. And yet, and this is an important contribution to the book, it resists the overreach and disproportionality the equality and diversity agenda has had on workplaces, not infrequently through amorphous terms such as safety and well-being. And this university is certainly not immune from these tendencies. So since March this year, indoor protests have been completely banned, even when entirely peaceful, all on the basis, in the words of the Vice-Chancellor, safety for our university community. Now, the key message I take from Josh's book here is the imperative of asking questions in this context, where they're offered acute sensitivities, heightened emotions, and where identity politics is acute. I'm a member of the advisory group to the Australian Human Rights Commission's inquiry into racism at universities. Now, while opposing racism at university might seem straightforward, let me suggest there are foundational questions that need to be asked in this process, especially as we contemplate laws and policies that impose penalties. Fundamentally, we need to be asking, what do we understand by racism? How does that relate to concepts of racial discrimination as understood under anti-discrimination law? How do we understand the term safety? How do we understand the term cultural safety? When protected attributes under racial discrimination acts do not actually extend to culture, which is a much broader term than race, ethnicity, nationality, or national origin. And how do we effectively address racism at universities while ensuring they operate as institutions of free and critical inquiry and where there's a robust exercise of academic freedom? Let me be brief with the final two insights I draw from Josh's book, and they come to the theme of democracy. And one is explicit and the other one is implicit. The explicit one is, Josh has mentioned, I think that the book argues very cogently that the prevailing understanding of democracy is limited and selective. The conventional understanding, some call it the liberal democratic understanding, does not apply beyond the factory gates and office doors. But if the will of the people shall be the basis of authority of government, as stated in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, why shouldn't it extend to private government? Yeah? And Josh's book here draws on the work of Elizabeth Anderson in characterizing the power of the employer as such. And why shouldn't trade unions as collective organizations be viewed as essential democratic institutions? Lastly, in my mind, the book reminds us of the central importance of the spirit of democracy. And this is a phrase from Alexis de Tocqueville. And it captures importance not only of institutions, but of civil engagement and a sense of community. And what I want to draw out here is the critical importance of a democratic ethos. And here, Josh's method of argument has much to teach us. Fidelity to the facts. Embrace the complexity of democratic and human life, what Immanuel Kant called the crooked timber of humanity. Be vigilant against inconsistencies and hypocrisy. Resist groupthink and tribalism, and most importantly, oppose mob justice. And finally, speak truth to power. Thank you, Josh.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity to speak about Josh's book. I want to acknowledge him and thank him for the book. My research interests lie in freedom of speech and academic freedom, and for that reason I really want to focus my remarks on what is said here about the university. So I want to agree that both academic freedom and freedom of speech are imperilled by the turn towards the corporate university, which are thoroughly and in a spirited fashion detailed in this book. The book, really shows us how, really demonstrates the depth of the phenomenon of the university being promoted as a brand, the central control by high-paid executive, and notably the importation of human resources standards and practices from the private sector. And I do want to sound my strong agreement with the undesirability of standards imposed on academics, like not to bring the university into disrepute. For as you will see, sometimes I think it is the academic's job to bring the university into disrepute. Now, the long-term project here seems to be make universities like other institutions of the private sector. And this is a very difficult aspect of academic life. But things are actually much worse than that. There are another set of pressures, an entirely different set of complaints that are made about universities that come from a totally different political base. At the same time as we are dealing with the corporate turn, we are also facing in universities a populist attack on universities from the right. So the complaint here is not that universities are too much like corporations, but that they are in fact the captives of a degenerate postmodern professoriate who indoctrinate a generation of students variously described as snowflakes or, especially in recent times, extremist and dangerous activists. Now, these two attacks on the university, coming from different directions, have something in common. They entail the co-option of the university for another project. On the one hand, the maximisation of profit, and on the other, what I think is actually a more sinister project, to undermine the credibility of universities in ways that prevent them holding governments to account. Now, what is missing from our public debate about universities and what is necessary to resist these dual attacks is an appreciation of the public, or dare I even say the constitutional purposes of universities. Universities are centrally institutions that engage in the pursuit and dissemination of knowledge through teaching and research. And there's a public benefit that comes from research. And in fact, the pursuit of knowledge turns out to be essential for democratic governance. In fact, it is part of what I would call the epistemic infrastructure of democratic government. Without knowledge, reliable, evidence-based knowledge produced in accordance with disciplinary method, it is increasingly difficult to engage in the complex decision-making required of governance in a modern society, to hold governments accountable, and if you have any doubts about the importance of knowledge towards accountability, think of the recent sacking of the Commissioner for the Bureau of Labour Statistics in the United States, precisely to avoid the accountability from the knowledge produced by that institution. It also helps us deal with the disagreements that are a fact of political life. Political life is difficult enough when we face disagreements of value. It becomes impossible when we actually bring our own facts to our disagreements and have no way of resolving our disagreements about facts. Universities are important institutions which can help us with the task of governing democratically. But in our public debate, there's an absence of any real defence of universities in these terms. Now, the current government doesn't seem to hate universities as much as those on the popular right, but nor does it have much depth of vision. Universities are usually defended either for their contribution to our overall economic well-being, and I can't tell you how many times I hear somebody defending universities by saying education is our most important export that we don't dig out of the ground, or they're seen as institutions that promote social mobility. Now, both of those things are actually quite good things, but they don't go to the central and distinctive research and teaching mission of the university. So for that reason, while I deeply appreciate this book, I actually want to sound a note of warning about thinking of universities within the framework of the book, which is really a book about freedom of speech and corporatisation. So let me say a couple of things. First of all, academic freedom should be separated from freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is something that all of us in the university community should enjoy equally with each other and equally with all citizens. Academic freedom, however, should not be thought of in those terms. It is not to be thought of as a workplace right designed to ensure a fair workplace and to correct the power imbalances between employer and employee. Now, to be clear, I want us to have a fair workplace and to correct the power imbalances between employer and employees. I just don't think that that is the role of academic freedom. It is better conceived of as a privilege that attaches not to individuals but to the activity of teaching and research, and it's designed not to ensure workplace fairness but to promote the distinctive constitutional role as a university as a knowledge institution. So let me conclude then. If you take what I have just said seriously, I think a few things follow. Now, in light of this book, I hope you will be more aware of the dangers of co-option of universities to a corporate brand. But the response should not be to co-opt them for another purpose, such as social transformation to our desired ends. It is not the job of universities as an institution to promote a particular vision of social justice, Rather, it is their job to maximise space in which many visions of a good and just society can be explored. So, as tempting it might be to think about universities as institutions which are designed to promote some version of justice, in fact, that overlooks their distinctive function, an element of democratic government on which our well-being depends. So, just to end on a controversial note, which seems, frankly, to be at least in the spirit of the book, I would say, for example, universities should not exercise their institutional voice in support of a particular view of any issue of the day, whether it be same-sex marriage, the voice, or the war in Gaza. They should maintain institutional silence, not neutrality, which I would say is a claim they can never make, but silence in order to maximise space within the forum that they provide for diverse voices.
There you go. So that's a controversial way of looking at this. Look, I love this book. As a journalist, I've followed every single one of these controversies with a strong sense of outrage and also a real sense of dismay, because it seems to me that collectively they tell us something about our culture and where our culture is going and ways in which our culture is going awry. And I really want to focus on that, because if you think about all of the incidents of people suffering unfair consequences for their acts of speech or exercise of academic freedom, to separate those two things out, if you think about them all, they all actually required individuals to make the decisions that these actions were appropriate. That it was appropriate to fire Scott McIntyre for making comments about Anzac Day. That it was appropriate to sack Antoinette Lattouf for reposting a tweet from Human Rights Watch. And I sort of wonder about the world in which people can start to think like that, where they can start to get the idea that somebody should lose their job, their livelihood, because of one act of speech. And it seems to me that part of the sort of the set of circumstances behind the problem actually is a legal set of circumstances, which is, in Australia, we don't have any First Amendment, we don't have any protection of free speech. Yes, this is a room full of lawyers. I know you're going to talk about the implied freedom of political communication found by the High Court in Lange and all those other cases. But the truth of the matter is that that is pretty weak. Like, basically that acts as a moderation on a government that passes a law that curtails free speech and basically says is it proportionate or not. That's all it is. We don't really have any sense of citizens having rights separate to or prior to these acts for which they are getting into serious trouble. I was interested, actually, Josh, in speaking just then, was talking about that moment when you sign your employment contract, and he used a phrase about this idea of giving away your rights in your employment contract. And I thought, what rights? Like, what are you giving away to begin with? Because you don't really have them. And we don't have a culture in Australia where we think about those rights. Let me give you a couple of examples. Many years ago, when I was a reporter on the Age newspaper, I was covering a story about a nurses' strike. And generally speaking, when there's any sort of conflict and there are parties to the conflict, the parties will want to feed you a version of the story. So I could have gone to the employer hospitals and they would have given me a nurse who would have said that the hospitals are great and they're treated brilliantly. I could have gone to the union and they would have given me a nurse who would say the conditions are appalling and everything in their log of claims should be met. Instead, I thought, what if I actually go out and find an actual, just real random nurse who is doing their job and chat to that person about their life and do a colour story? And my news desk was very keen to do that. I contacted my sister, who is a nurse, and she gave me names and phone numbers for a few dozen of her colleagues. I called all of those people, and every single one of them said, I could not talk to you. I would get into trouble. And I said, listen, I'm not even, like, I mean, yes, the backdrop is there's this dispute. I just want to do a colour piece about what it's like to be a nurse, what the life is like, what the work is like. It's about informing the community about what this is like. And every single person thought from the beginning to the end that they had actually no right to speak to the media or engage in this sort of civic conversation. So I think we start from a position of a really jaundiced sense of our own rights. We don't have any sense that we've got rights that run parallel to those employment contracts, that we have rights as citizens. We sort of see ourselves in many ways as only having these sort of marketplace rights. And I think that that is part of the reason that you're seeing this phenomenon, as well as other things like the ways in which algorithms are affecting the way we consume information, which are making us less used to experiencing voices with which we disagree, less used to institutions that are able to hold these sort of spaces open, and more used to giving into demands that people be punished for their speech acts. Just one other thing quickly, and then we'll open up to questions, because I think it'd be great to sort of hear from everybody in the audience. As everyone was talking, I thought also about something which I think is really problematic in all of these cases, which is the tendency to blame the victims, and blame them in a way that can seem like you're being fair-minded or one hand or the other. And it reminded me actually of the British author Salman Rushdie, when the fatwa was put on him about that book, The Satanic Verses, a book which I heard him interviewed recently about, and he talked about the fact that he sort of really thought of that as a comic novel, not as a deliberate provocation, and he didn't expect the consequence that flowed from that. But when that flowed and the British government actually spent a lot of money on security for him, there was a huge amount of criticism of Rushdie. And there was a tendency to sort of say, basically, you brought it on yourself, you poked the bear, you shouldn't have done this. And you get a similar type of thing with so many of these cases. I mean, you look at the Latouf case, Ida Buttrose, the ABC chair, says, you know, I'm sick of getting these complaints, which basically is just like a mentality of, I just wish people would just be quiet and not create any trouble or not ever make anything happen. Now, that's a particularly stark example in a particular case, because in journalism, your job is to make trouble. Your job is to walk towards the trouble. You have to do it. If you don't do that, you're not doing your job. You have to do it in a respectful, courteous, polite way. But that is the nature of the work, in the same way that, you know, academia rests on this idea of free inquiry. But there are many walks of life in which walking towards trouble isn't necessarily part of the role. But even then, when people find themselves in these situations, there's an extraordinary willingness to dump incredibly extreme consequences on these people without any real sense of the idea that they might actually have a right as individual citizens that runs concurrently or separate to their employment, that's not extinguished by their employment. And I think Josh has done a terrific job in highlighting these issues. I feel like the moment that we are in, these are continuing to be challenges for institutions that try to hold open those difficult public spaces. And I really worry about where we will go if we don't think about this, not just as a legal problem, but also as a cultural problem. So I'm going to stop there and we can sort of go to questions from the floor, but thank you.
I can, or I can open the questions. What suits?
Well, if you can limit your response to a couple of minutes.
Couple of minutes? Okay, I'll try to limit my response to what was a remarkable set of perspectives to a few minutes. Perhaps the best way to do that is to say, as part of this book, I wrestled with many of the issues that have just been discussed in amazing breadth and diversity, and tried to reach a conclusion about my views about free speech and analyse the excesses of the left and the right. I'm a creature of the left, and so part of the process was wrestling with where I stood on left-wing cancel culture, which is derided as non-existent by brilliant intellects who I admire, like Jason Stanley, an authority on fascism, people like that. Say there is no left-wing cancel culture. In the end, I came back. What I discovered about myself is, although I'm a raging lefty who believes in strong unions and so on, I also am very attached to liberal democratic notions of free speech, and trying to chart a consistent course through all of the debates about free speech and harmful speech, and the line between those two is enormously difficult, and it's very hard not to be a hypocrite. But it has enormous value, and what happens when these exercises that go on with corporate cancel culture is, mob justice is delivered, it's fundamentally illiberal, punitive, nasty. It doesn't seek to engage with a person who they disagree with. This is the culture point that you so powerfully make. It's a punishment. We're not going to disagree with you. We're going to punish you by depriving you of your income and adding a lot of death threats in there as well. And what I hope that happens, I would like corporate power to be reined in, but I don't see too many green shoots at the moment in that direction. But because of what's happened with Gaza, we've seen the left and the right shift position, completely backflip. The left now specialises in macroaggressions. It says bugger micro. We're not interested in microaggressions. We can chant and yell and scream and spray paint and so on as loud as we want. Don't you dare try and shut us down. And the right has discovered human rights discourse and anti-racism for one particular part of the community only. But I sort of expect that the right is not going to have any rational... I expect much more from my side of politics. I'm hoping that through this process that the left revisits its thinking about its version of cancel culture, which I critique. I still think the right-wing cancel culture and the attacks on free speech from Donald Trump and other authoritarians and fascism, that's a much more serious source of repression than activists on social media from the left. But I'm hoping that we get progress on my side of the political divide as a result of Gaza, that terrible, terrible tragedy and disaster in Gaza, I'm hoping has some positive impact on our culture. There's so much in those discussions, I can't in 2 minutes do them justice, but thank you so much to everybody on the panel because they're fantastic, different responses.